Okay, we're being recorded. I'm Bruce McGee. I'm here today with Thomas Ruys Smith, but you like to be called Tom, is that right?
Yeah, that's fine, thank you.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. You wrote an article I want to get to in a minute about Sam Clemens visiting New Orleans during Mardi Gras. But first, I'd like to know a little bit about you. Like, are you originally from England?
Yeah, born and bred. Grew up in a small town called Norwich. Currently live on the outskirts of London, and I work at the University of East Anglia, which is also based in Norwich.
And so how did you come to be interested in the middle of the United States? Because most of your work seems to be about the Mississippi River or some derivative thereof.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I need a better origin story. But basically, it's through the work of Mark Twain, really. So that was the gateway. And reading Twain's river books, I wanted to know more about the context that he was writing in when he was writing about the river, and I wanted to know more about the world that had given birth to him as a river writer. And so that took me on a journey over the last almost couple of decades now, really, trying to piece together the cultural life of the Mississippi around Mark Twain.
And it may be that folks don't realize at the time he grew up, this was the frontier. Yeah. Nowadays we think of the frontier as California, but that was off in the future a bit. And this was frontier life, was river life, going up and down the Mississippi, and you saw all the kinds of things you see at the edge of a civilization. Okay, well, I wanted to talk about a letter that he wrote, and you wrote one of the very few articles I've seen on that, the letter to Pamela Moffett. And I just want to put in a clip. Let's see, share screen. This is the beginning of the letter, if I can successfully. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so to me, the amazing thing about that letter is this is years before Mark Twain. He's what, 22 years old? A kid from the perspective of a 62-year-old man. But the voice is already there, that turn of a phrase. You know, people come on some of the Facebook groups I'm on and say, when did people start thinking of New Orleans as a tourist destination? And if it wasn't before then, it's certainly now. He sees what this could be, right?
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about young Mark Twain and his experience of New Orleans?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
or young Sam Clemens, I think it's
young Sam Clemens. Yeah. He's young. He's not that young at this point, actually. He's born in 1835. So by this point, he's a bit older than 22. But I think what's also worth remembering is that even though he's relatively young, he's already had an enormous number of experiences by this point, because he starts working at a very young age. So in the middle of his teens, really, he needs to start working to help his family out. And
so he spent some time working for a newspaper by this point before he got on. Okay, yeah.
That's right, yeah. So he starts off in publishing, working in newspaper offices and print rooms, not just along the river, but also around the nation. So relatively early on in his life, he's traveled around St. Louis, Philadelphia, New York, Washington. And that's even before he gets to the world of the steamboat. And it's in the late 1850s that he, mid to late 1850s, that he actually decides that he's going to go back to the river and learn how to pilot a steamboat. And he's been doing that for a couple of years by this point. It takes him 2 years to get his pilot's license, which is quite an ordeal. It's quite an amazing.
It's an apprentice system, right? It's not like you go to school. Why don't you talk about the apprentice system of becoming a riverboat pilot?
Yes, you have to find an existing pilot who's going to agree to teach you the river and teach you piloting.
For a cut of your salary.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So that in itself is a really extraordinary feat of memory. And this is what Mark Twain always kind of frames it as, because to pilot a steamboat, you need to really be able to memorize about 1,000 miles of Mississippi, both ways, because it looks different both ways, during the day and during the nighttime. So the ideal for a pilot was that you would be able to be dropped into the pilot house of any steamboat at any point on the river, and you would know where you were and what you need to avoid running into. And this is something you have to keep constantly refreshing as well, because the river's constantly changing. So it takes him 2 years, unsurprisingly. And then this letter is written when he's a licensed pilot. And he's a licensed pilot from 1859 to 1861 until the outbreak of the war shuts the river down to traffic. And I think he does roughly 100 journeys up and down the Mississippi during that time. So he spends, quite a bit of time in New Orleans at the end of those journeys, and has a variety of experiences there. And this letter is
as one does.
As one does, yes, absolutely, yes. So that was very much the case then as now, I think. And you can get that sense from his letters home. So this letter that we're talking about today is one that's written to his sister and his mother, and talks about his experiences at Mardi Gras. But if you read some of the other letters, so he writes a letter to his brother Orion, talking about a long drunken lunch that he spends in 1860, and he specifically says in that letter, "Don't tell mother about this." So even then, he's also, not only is he kind of developing the Mark Twain voice, he's also writing for different audiences quite consciously.
Right, and you notice the letter is written on, part of it on March 9th and part of it on March 11th. Probably know what he's doing on March 10th, which is recovering.
Yeah.
Not able to write today, thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's also really fascinating about his time as a young steamboat pilot is we need to acknowledge that he's in quite a privileged position as a steamboat pilot in these years. He's very proud of himself for having achieved this rank, and he boasts in letters home about the speed with which he's achieved this rank. He boasts about the kind of boats that he gets to work on. It really does give him a certain status on the river. It gives him a disposable income. It gives him a position in river life, which is kind of at the top of the hierarchy, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, next to the captain, the pilot is, and maybe even in some ways, the pilot's the guy that keeps you from getting in a wreck. But
yeah,
the captain's putting out fires and dealing with stuff. But the pilot had a kind of a unique esteem in the minds of the people on the river and in the towns around it.
Yeah, and to some extent, Twain helps to build that mythology as well. I think after his time on the river, much of what we have when we think about the piloting life comes from Twain's interpretation of the job, and he's definitely not shy about presenting it as one of the most esteemed positions that you can achieve in the world, and one of the greatest tasks you can accomplish. So there is definitely some self-aggrandizement in his portrait of the pilot. But yeah, no, the pilot was absolutely a figure of authority and power on the river.
Well, think about the modern airplane pilot and the kind of esteem they have. There is a certain mystique about being a pilot, and that was before the airplane. This was it, the things flying up and down the river. Before
that's true.
People walked.
Yeah, and I think it also helps to, one of the big things that the steamboat does is to introduce a certain kind of glamour and cosmopolitanism to, because as you said, this is a frontier space before we get the steamboat, and it still is afterwards, but the steamboat helps to connect a kind of a wide network of people and places together, and it allows for the development of a certain kind of cultural life in the interior.
We expect from that part of the century the steamboat to be a very classy place. Have you ever come across Fanny Trollope?
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah.
Who explored a generation earlier, and she writes about the early, and she was an English upper class lady. A woman named Fanny Trollope could only be a New Orleans dancer or an upper class woman from England to be able to carry off that.
She used to live in a house down the road from where I'm sitting right now.
Oh my God!
So, yeah, so I'm a stone's throw away from one of her former residences.
The domestic manners of the Americans, I think, is what she, and she's very well impressed with New Orleans, but the steamboat at the time was just like a floating pigsty, you know. And I don't know if she elaborates this or if it's just literal truth, but you know, she's sitting, she's watching these Americans eat. They've got their long knives, you know, a Jim Bowie type knife, and they stick the meat in and then poke it in as far as they can down their throat, and then they jump up and leave. But in the meantime, they've started chewing some tobacco, which they spit in any direction. And if tobacco juice lands on a lady's dress, well, that's just the cost of going up and down the river. So early on, anyway, you get this very low, you know, but as time went on, they became the floating palace, you know. And
and I think, I mean, European travelers at that point try to outdo each other in kind of hyperbolic terms about how unsanitary steamboat life is, and the Mississippi becomes a place where European travelers really let rip about their misgivings about America. I mean, Dickens also hates the Mississippi when he travels on it. In his case, and I think in Trollope's case to a certain extent, that's partly because of the close association of the river with slavery. So Dickens there comes kind of face to face with the internal slave trade, and it's that vision of America, I think, that he's trying to portray through his particularly unhappy vision of the Mississippi. So I think that feeds into European portraits of the river often.
Well, she describes a kind of utopian settlement in the woods where you raise enough money, you buy a black person, you free them, but then they work on the farm to raise money to get freedom for more slaves. And
yeah, that's right. That's Francis Wright's utopian attempt at kind of emancipation, abolition. Yeah.
So back to Mark Twain. Talk about the view of Mardi Gras from the perspective of a young man in his 20s, and then we'll get to the old man's retrospective.
Sure, yeah. I mean, sorry, yeah, carry on.
I was just going to say, this seems to be unadulterated joy. You know, you haven't seen the United States until you've seen Mardi Gras in New Orleans. That shows up everywhere. Now, we in the Mark Twain Project are the only places on the internet that have the complete letter, but that excerpt gets quoted all over. You know,
it does, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
Better press than that. So anyway, talk about the youthful Mark Twain and his reaction to what he saw.
Well, a good pivot to Mark Twain also is that he really liked Francis Trollope. You know, he loves that account that you just talked about. Yeah. So when we get to grumpy old Mark Twain, then that's one of the accounts that he's reading when he's writing that later travel account. He really revels in those European attacks on America at that point. But yeah, back in 1859, yes, I think he really does indulge in that kind of picturesque tourism. And I think partly that is, again, because he's writing to his sister and his mother. So I think he's kind of knowingly playing it up for that audience, because I think he knows that they're going to find it kind of titillating on some level.
Oh, the free and easy ladies.
Yes. So perhaps gently shocking. Also probably suspicious of its Catholic associations, which he makes clear at this point.
Right.
So I think, yes, he's writing for that audience particularly. But yeah, I think it does, and you often get that sense of delight, if you like, in these early letters that Twain sends home from the river. That this is a space for him as a young man working on the steamboat at the top of this hierarchy with spare money and spare time. This is that kind of touristic playground. And so, yeah, I think this is a point at which, tourists are already traveling to New Orleans, and it's this kind of otherness that New Orleans seems to provide, both for Americans traveling within America and Europeans traveling within America,
And
that it specializes in.
he gets off the boat, I think, a little bit downriver from the Vieux Carré, just right, the next thing over. But it's quite a trek to get to St. Charles and watch the Mystic Crew of Como. So, there's part of the day that's left out, but the part that's in there is quite fascinating. You just got people in costumes.
Yeah.
It's that eye for detail, that brilliant observational skill. He just packs these sentences. Here's this giant woman in calico coming down the middle of a street, Spanish cavalier, but wait, it's a girl and she's addressing me. By the beard of the prophet, madam, I don't think we've met, but it's Mardi Gras and you can step outside of your normal limits and talk to a cute little young river pilot and ride off, and your reputation is no the worse for wear.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can see the way that that Twain first really comes to celebrity through his travel writing. So absolutely. In a sense, he's rehearsing that form in this kind of sketch that he's writing home.
Think of the miracle that we have these letters.
Yeah,
I know people saved letters more then than they do now, but still, this could have gone into, gotten lost or something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how much of a record there is really of this time in his life in one way or another. And there's plenty that we don't know. And there's plenty that gets left out, I think, probably from these letters.
Maybe some stories about the free and easy ladies.
Yes, I think that kind of thing particularly, yeah. And you can get hints of that. But I suppose the contrast that you would note from his later travel writing comes in that sense of kind of earnest enthusiasm that you get here. Because I suppose when he really becomes famous as a travel writer, writing about Europe and the West as well, there is that sense of satire, kind of sardonic humor, critique that runs through it. But here we have a much more
in his traveling. He calls himself an innocent, but he's jaded by that time. Get to the promised land and you're expecting kingdoms. They're more like chiefs of a Native American tribe. These kingdoms are tiny. It's just, I'm used to America, man, and everything's big. Get over here.
Yeah, and he's playing that for satire, certainly.
Right.
But yeah, it's fascinating. I think that there isn't that sense of critique or sardonicness here. I think that here we have a far more truly innocent vision of it. That said, I think one of the things that I think is really interesting about his time on the river and his letters home and this period generally in his life is the degree to which he does not pay much attention to slavery, because that is one of the big things that the travelers to New Orleans will talk about at this point, inevitably, because it's the place which is the biggest marketplace for the internal slave trade. It's an unavoidable subject on the river and in New Orleans.
Was he?
But it's interesting, given the trajectory of Twain's kind of career in some ways, that he has no intention of talking about it really.
Was his hometown a slave town like Hannibal? So it's kind of invisible to him in one sense. Yeah.
It was, and the way he talks about it, I argue in my latest book that he never really comes to a kind of proper reckoning with it in many ways, because even when he's looking back on it in the 1890s, he still seems to think that the kind of slavery that was in Hannibal was not as bad as the slavery elsewhere. And he understands from that early point that being sold down the river is a fate that enslaved people fear in his location. But of course, when he joins the steamboat trade, he becomes part and parcel of that industry.
Right.
So, again, this is not, and he never talks about this particularly, but inevitably, with a million people being transported down the river, a million enslaved people being transported down the river between 1820 and 1860, his boats would have been part of that internal slave trade.
Right. I guess every ship probably had slaves on it at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sale, not just traveling with their masters. But.
Yeah, and also working on the boats as well. Like William Wells Brown did, for example, before he self-emancipated. And it's interesting how his vision of New Orleans here, the black New Orleanians are kind of pretty much absent from his vision here as well. He talks about minstrels at one point,
right,
and he always has a fondness for minstrels, but which, of course, in this instance, I think probably means minstrelsy, white performers blacking up to perform as stereotyped Black Americans.
Right. And there's one, I guess you're familiar with Duval, 40 Years a Gambler on the Mississippi. Yeah. And at one point he gets in trouble with some guys. And so he's able to sneak off the boat by literal blackface, he rubs coal all over himself and grabs something and carries it off the boat in really raggedy clothes, and they just never notice him. It's almost literally invisible. Here they are trying on the lookout. It never occurs to them that might be Duval. Of course, who knows how much of his stuff is alive.
Well, that's very true. That is very true. But Duval and others, I think, are also interesting figures because, we're talking about the status of pilots and the kind of respectability and the status of pilots. But, as well as being part and parcel of the internal slave trade, steamboats are also places where, gambling is rife. Often crews were getting a profit of gamblers' takes on the boats. So, it has that underworld quality as well. And that's intrinsically part of it. And New Orleans, of course, has a reputation for gambling, for partying already by this point. So that's a big part of life on board as well. It's not all kind of clean cut, certainly.
Well, in some way, it's betwixt and between. There was the great sandbar fight that occurred between Natchez and Vidalia. And they went there in the sandbar in the middle of the river because there was no jurisdiction. They wanted to have a showdown. And I would imagine being on the river was kind of like that. It was you could get away with gambling even if the towns on either side would not allow it. This is its own thing, right? Yeah,
they do become a world unto themselves, definitely, with their own sense of jurisdiction. They are a space that, as you say, is kind of apart from either bank, and that it's a space where people step out of normal life to a certain extent, and in a whole host of ways experience life differently when they're on board a steamboat at this point.
Right, you're meeting people literally from around the country and around the world. And they have their own society almost that forms.
Definitely.
And the crew are the people that are there all the time. And so I guess the captain gets to be, even today you can get married by a captain of a ship. It's kind of
right. Yes.
Right. So he's kind of the law of the ship.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to Twain's later reassessment of Mardi Gras, because he's considerably soured on the topic over the years, which seems to me to say more about Twain than it does about Mardi Gras. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think it says something about both, really, because by the time that Twain goes back to the river in 1881, 1882, he's been away pretty much for the intervening 20 years. He does come close to the river a couple of times, but this is his first sustained journey back to the river, and it's a trip he's been planning for a long time at this point. He keeps trying to convince different companions to go with him. He spends a long time trying to get William Dean Howells to go on this journey with him.
How old is he at this point?
Twain? He's reaching 50, so late 40s.
So a very old man.
He's established at this point as a literary figure. He's kind of got a new respectability really through marriage. He's married well. He's wealthy. He's well-to-do. He's a father. So he can chart quite a long distance in a sense between the Twain who was at Mardi Gras in 1859 and the one who turns up in New Orleans in the early 1880s. Right. So he is a different figure in some senses. But on the other hand, he also reaches New Orleans at quite an important point, I think, in terms of the culture of reunion that's taking place in America more broadly after the war, in the process of New Orleans becoming a kind of picturesque tourist destination for Americans in a whole new way. I mean, tourists might have traveled to New Orleans in the 1850s, but this is the point at which it starts actually attracting large numbers of visitors from across America.
Yes, I would think that at the time he first showed up, it's the odd European or American from another part of the country who shows up, but it's not yet an industry. Tourism is one of the leading industries of both New Orleans and Louisiana as a whole at this point, now in 2012. It was before COVID, who knows? Sure. But what you're saying is this is the point where the actual industrial complex starts to take off and large numbers of people are showing up.
Yeah. And it's also the point at which, or at least it's during the process of which the South is reasserting certain things. Yeah, so it's reasserting white supremacy post-Reconstruction, right? And it's using its kind of cultural and social institutions to kind of reach out to the North to present a picturesque view of itself and its institutions, to sell that kind of lost cause view of the South to a wider audience, and that's a successful cultural approach, really.
Moonlight and magnolias.
Moonlight and magnolias, absolutely, yeah. And that's something that you can see across popular literature throughout the 1880s and 1890s. And events like Mardi Gras absolutely become wrapped up in that. So I think, the reason that Twain sours on Mardi Gras, or at least takes that position in Life on the Mississippi, is because he is taking a position there, if you like, against that process of kind of cultural rehabilitation that the South's undergoing. So he stands out really quite significantly amongst his contemporaries in the 1880s by presenting that view of Mardi Gras. Well, and by attacking it in those kind of terms.
He was at this point friends with George Washington Cable, who also, he wrote The Silent South as a protest against Jim Crow and the end of Reconstruction, and basically got himself run off from New Orleans. Like he was from there, but he wore out his welcome with his trying to do civil rights, not maybe in the terms we would today, but he was way too liberal for them at the time. And I think they hung out some when Twain was in New Orleans, if I remember.
They did, yeah. That's when they first meet, and and that's all. Actually, I think they might have met previously, but they certainly cement their friendship there, and that's the prelude to Twain and Cable going on tour.
Yes, so they go on a long. Used to read Parson Joan, which is almost his only funny thing. Like most of his stuff is really serious, a melodrama, but this is hilarious.
And so they go on a long lecture tour together, and that lecture tour takes place just as Cable is making those kind of public statements that you just referenced, and in many ways Cable arguably makes more kind of public pronouncements about civil rights and the South and race than Twain does. Twain comes closest probably to explicitly attacking the South as a concept in Life on the Mississippi, in this passage around Mardi Gras, where he tries to suggest, that Mardi Gras is actually representative of much deeper problems within Southern society as he sees it. But he never actually attacks slavery directly or the legacies of slavery directly.
It's more the way that your Abraham Lincoln's figures pop up, like Huck tries to free Jim, the boss in a Connecticut Yankee. Mm-hmm. They eventually end up ending slavery, and they talk about the evils of slavery. So very much, like in sci-fi, you deal with problems of race on the Enterprise that you can't deal with in a regular TV show at the time. You frame it differently and deal with it obliquely. You know, I think the message is clear, but you have to be, you know, open to hearing it.
Yeah. I think with Twain, I mean, one of the interesting things I found when I was writing recently about this lecture tour that Twain and Cable undertake is that it is difficult to say exactly how audiences understood a book like Huckleberry Finn, for example, in its moment, because the extracts that Twain chooses to read from that book on the reading tour are probably the sections that these days critics would suggest are the more problematic parts of the book. Right. The ones in which they seem to be playing Jim's slavery and kind of recapturing that book for comic effect. But Twain seems to be, you know, playing that straight for laughs, and that's how the audience seems to be understanding it. So the degree to which
invented stand-up comedy, as far as I can tell, you know, like just this, especially the storytelling type of, you know, that the joke deliver, you know, set up, deliver punchline, but the long form, you know, and he was brilliant. Like he packed them out, and like he could just stand there and look at them and then start laughing. So
I mean, interestingly as well, I think that there is a chapter that he writes when he's drafting Life on the Mississippi, which does directly talk about slavery. It actually kind of says, you know, slavery, in very explicit terms, slavery was bad, it's a good thing it's gone. But he cuts that chapter from the book. And whether it's him or his publisher who kind of pushes that, because he doesn't want to alienate Southern audiences too much.
It's still unpopular in certain parts of the South to come out too strong, strongly against slavery.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think that's the and you know, as much as Twain by critiquing Mardi Gras as he does in Life on the Mississippi, he's using that as a kind of a stick to beat the South with. He's using that as an example of what he sees as the problems in Southern culture. It's interesting that he doesn't come out with that kind of explicit statement, while someone like Cable does, and as you say, kind of has to leave the South. And as much as Twain and Cable, as much as Twain and Cable are friends at the beginning of their reading tour, they famously they fall out very, very viciously on that tour, and Twain never has a good word to say about him again.
Oh my goodness!
So
talk a little bit more about
the relationship.
What did he say negatively about the Mardi Gras in that passage? You mentioned, you alluded to it, but what was, you know, get into the details a little bit about the evaluation.
Rather than kind of delight in the picturesque detail as he did in 1859, he sees Mardi Gras as a symbol of what he sees as a kind of a cod medieval fabricated concept of honor and nobility and the kind of values that he associates with the work of Walter Scott.
Right, of course. Walter Scott again. I mean, he has this great send-up of the old Capitol of Louisiana, the Capitol building. Oh, yeah. It looks like something Walter Scott would have designed. It's just it pops up from time to time. And I guess a Connecticut Yankee was a critique of the Sir Walter Scott type of writing.
Definitely, Funny enough, I think the next book I'm writing will be about Walter Scott's impact on American literature. So I'll definitely have a chapter on Twain in there. But Twain uses him as a symbol of, and also it's part of, it uses him as a symbol of romance, and he's still kind of attacking the romantic pre-war culture at this point. So he attacks Walter Scott, he attacks James Fenimore Cooper. So he's also involving them in a broader cultural war that he sees himself as fighting here, that goes beyond North versus South, but as part of a kind of romance versus realism argument. So you might even see this description of Mardi Gras as Twain really constantly pivoting from romance to realism, that he allows himself that romance in 1859, but he's trying to present a kind of realist vision of Mardi Gras as he sees it anyway in 1882. So he calls it girly girly. He uses that phrase. He sees it as an evidence of the Walter Scott disease, as we've said. So evidence of that kind of cultural influence of as he sees it, a kind of false cultural idol that's been erected around that kind of romantic sense of identity that Walter Scott promotes, if you like.
Little does he know, most New Orleanians don't read.
I mean, interestingly enough, in 1885, the Rex Parade, the Rex Ball, is themed around Ivanhoe, Walter Scott's novel.
Oh my gosh!
I think the first Rex Parade is based around a Walter Scott book called The Talisman. So Scott was definitely feeding into the aesthetics of Mardi Gras at this point, if you like, and that kind
seems
of
like the year he was there, they were keyed in on board games, maybe, or parlor games, like cards and
and also this is a point at which Mardi Gras is put to political use. So there will be caricatures of figures. So Benjamin Butler, of course, who's infamous in New Orleans during the war as the Union general in charge of the city, he gets caricatured. Lincoln gets caricatured. So this does become a space in which those kind of old battles can get re-legislated as well in a satirical way. So there is an element to which Mardi Gras is being used explicitly within that broader kind of cultural war that's ongoing past the end of the actual shooting war, if you like.
Well, and Rex does represent the elite of New Orleans. I don't know that Zulu was around yet, the answering part from, the people that are being discriminated against. That'll come along eventually.
Yeah, I think that's kind of late 19th, early 20th century. The Zulu starts.
So partly it's his age, partly he's seeing things that weren't there before, because 1859, it's on the cusp of the war.
Yeah.
And partly, well, I guess that's mainly it.
I think there's also a biographical element to it as well. It isn't an emotionally easy trip for him in many ways, because he's going back to the scenes of his youth.
And there is so much.
There is just a kind of a sense of mortality that hangs over this trip, especially as it's so long awaited. Lots of the rivermen that he knew, that he expects to meet again, are dead. He doesn't recognize the river anymore. So, we talked earlier about the degree to which, as a pilot, you learn the river intimately. Well, the river's changed a lot since then. And also steamboating itself at this point is far less of an important part of America's infrastructure than it was.
The railroads here.
Yeah. So the railroads have fully kind of taken the passenger traffic that's in steep decline by this point. So it's a far less kind of essential service than it was when Twain was young. And so he laments quite a lot during this book about the changes that he's noticed, that everything seems kind of freighted with that kind of morbid viewpoint that he brings to it. So I think that might be part of it as well, to a certain degree.
Well, even his pen name came from the river. Why don't you tell our listeners about Mark Twain before it was a name?
That is a kettle of fish. Clearly Mark Twain is a phrase that is heard in Twain's day along the river, because it's a cry that's given out as the depth of the water is measured. So you have a leadsman who's lowering a rope into the river so he can measure how deep the water is, so that the pilot can work out his trajectory and whether or not he's in safe water, if he's got enough water to float in, basically. And so much is made within the scholarship about exactly what it means when the boat hits Mark Twain, right? It's a kind of liminal moment in the water, because it's a kind of point between deep water and shallow water. Does it mean safety? Does it mean approaching danger? All these kind of things. So Mark Twain does have a resonance in river life as a phrase before he uses his pen name. But there is a lot of debate about exactly when and why he starts using it as a pen name. And I think probably people assume that the story people have found enough archival material to suggest that the story that Twain always tells about it is not necessarily the right one. So Twain says that he steals the pen name, basically, from another steamboat pilot who writes kind of rather stentorian and boring columns about the river. And so Twain parodies him by and steals his pen name, basically. But I think there's more of a consensus now amongst Twain scholars that Twain probably starts using it when he's out west, first of all. And it could refer to other things like marking up 2 drinks on a bar tab, which is something that he was famous for doing, or that it comes from a cartoon in Vanity Fair magazine. I think that's another one that he sees probably at some point while he's out west after river life. But I think regardless of exactly why and when he uses it, I think there's clearly got to be some sense of appeal to him in the way that it does evoke the river, and that remains a key part of his identity right until the end of his life.
One of the hazards you faced in the water, a tree, I can't remember exactly what it means, but they called it a Sawyer, like Tom Sawyer. I mean, these terms just keep popping up through the rest of his life.
Sawyer is a tree that's stuck in the riverbed, and so it kind of bobs up and down. So that's something you don't want to run into when you're piloting a steamboat. That's one of them. I mean, that's the thing as well. I think we talked about the analogies between piloting a steamboat and piloting an aeroplane, but steamboating is dangerous in this period. Plenty of explosions. That's the main danger. Right. And that's something that Twain himself has a kind of personal connection to, because his brother, who also joins the steamboat trade, he's killed in a steamboat explosion on a boat that Twain should have been on.
Oh my goodness.
But he has to leave the boat early because he's had a fight with the pilot of that boat, and he's put off. And his brother Henry stays on, and that boat explodes, and his brother Henry is killed. And that's a really significant moment in Twain's life, I think, and in his understanding of the river. And it's something he comes back to quite frequently. And the first really sustained bit of writing he does on the river in a book called The Gilded Age, which he writes with Charles Dudley Warner. So it's the book that kind of gives the name to the age. They invent the term that then becomes used as a shorthand for the kind of 1870s, 1880s, that last part of the 19th century. It's the first time really that he turns to the river, and he turns it into prose. And he narrates a steamboat explosion in that. And he returns again to talking about Henry's experiences being blown up in life on the Mississippi. So this is definitely an event that haunts him. And that's another part of the steamboat trade, I think. That
imagine the survivor's guilt. Like if I'd been there, maybe I could have saved him. That would have been haunting.
That definitely sits with him, I think. Yeah, I mean, Twain is prone to a kind of a sense of guilt anyway, in various ways. And so, yeah, I think this is that's profoundly traumatic for him for that reason as well. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your two books on the Mississippi. Why don't you tell our listeners the titles and where they can find them? Because I think some of our listeners would be interested in pursuing this more.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the main two, which are explicitly about the river itself, are a kind of, I think of them as a kind of a joint enterprise in a sense, because they both are part and parcel of the same story that I wanted to tell, which is, as I said at the beginning, I wanted to evoke that wider cultural and social life of the Mississippi because of Twain's work. That's the kind of starting point, but I wanted to see what else was out there and understand the context that Twain was writing in when he was writing about the river. So my first book, called River of Dreams, Imagining the Mississippi Before Mark Twain, which is published by LSUP, Louisiana State University Press.
Yes, my alma mater.
Aha, yeah, I saw it on your cup actually. Yes.
Oh, LSU, yeah. If I can get it up, there we go.
So yeah, who are really great to work with, I should say as well. Actually, they're a really great press. But yeah, that first book is called Imagining the Mississippi Before Mark Twain, because I wanted to explore how the river worked in American culture before Mark Twain put his stamp on it. Because I think my argument across both these books is that Mark Twain is such a dominant force in American literature, but also in our understanding of the Mississippi River, that he really kind of overshadows everything else and everyone else who writes about the river, who otherwise uses the river in a creative fashion. So that first book explores the way that the Mississippi becomes well, first of all, part of American life from the Louisiana Purchase onwards, but also the way it's an important cultural force in American life before that. So I explore the kind of Jacksonian folk heroes who become associated with the river. There's a chapter about those European travelers who we were talking about before. So Francis Trollope has a good section in there. I talk about moving panoramas, which were an amazing popular entertainment form in the 19th century. So they were like early moving pictures, basically. So you'd paint an enormous canvas that was wound onto two rollers, and then you'd sit a paying audience in front of it, and you'd slowly turn a handle, and the picture would move in front of the audience. And the Mississippi was one of the really popular themes for these moving panoramas. So people across the world would pay their entrance fee, sit down and watch the Mississippi scroll past in front of them. And finally, in that book, I talk about, again, people like George Duval, as you said, so gamblers, and the way that gambling and crime become closely associated with the river.
Did you come across Liberty in Louisiana by James Workman?
No, I don't think so, actually.
I could send you a copy of that. We're working on, it's a play that celebrated the Louisiana Purchase. It's been out of print since 1805. So Stephen and I are trying to edit it and get it republished, but I could send you a pre-publication, Word document with it. But anyway, the two main characters are these kind of river rat guys. One's Irishman named Sawney, and the other one's Phelim, and the other one's a Scotsman named Sawney. And they're for all the world like the great grandfathers of the Duke and the Dauphin. One of them's more of a pure rascal. The other, Sawney McGregor, he's the Scotsman. He's got a conscience, but the other guy finds out that this rich young heiress is going to marry a captain that he bears a striking resemblance to. So he has this big plot to get rich by marrying her under false pretenses. And the whole play is, how are we going to keep this from happening? And, Sawney's conspiring against his friend. They find this pregnant girl that he left pregnant up in Kentucky. And they managed to bring her down to the city in a matter of 4 or 5 hours. Maybe she was following him, I don't know. But anyway, during the marriage, she's all veiled, and it winds up he's marrying the girl that he got pregnant rather than the rich heiress. Right. But it really, and Workman was in the East Coast at the time. Had never been to New Orleans. So some of this is stock figures from Plautus and, Shakespeare. But on the other hand, these characters keep popping up over and over. You've got to wonder, were there really rascals out on the river? And I imagine there probably were.
I think there probably were. Yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence for that, for the river as a space for crime or other nefarious doings, definitely. And that gets wrapped up with slavery as well, as we've said. And I think that's part and parcel of it. So if you think about the big, so someone like James Marrell, who's a big kind of folklore criminal in the 1830s onwards, his kind of criminality is closely associated with slavery and slave stealing and that kind of thing. And gambling too. Gambling gets wrapped up with slavery. I mean, plenty of commentators at the time say that gambling is only as prevalent as it is in the South because you've got a lot of people with a lot of disposable income, a lot of time on their hands. Lots of people traveling with both cash but also property in the form of enslaved people. And so, as a big part of abolitionist literature, abolitionists often use the image of planters gambling away enslaved people at the card table on a steamboat as a kind of a powerful image of the evils of slavery.
One of the books that publish records from the Cabildo, like court cases, and it's a lot of this guy was drunk, and this, but in this one case, the wife has a lawsuit to get the slave back that her husband lost gambling while he was drunk. I guess she's saying he wasn't in a state of mind and we need the slave. I don't know if she got him back or not, but anyway, apparently gambling, when you run out of money, well, there's this slave over here, I can gamble him away.
Yeah, that's a major trope in antebellum literature. Definitely, it's a scene that you see again and again, and normally presented as in the cause of abolition, as it were, as an example of slavery's problematics.
Yeah, and another one of these books that has to deal with slavery, an early anti-slavery book, is Mayne Reid's Quadroon. And they have the big race between steamboats. And I didn't know this. I guess this is true, that you can only get wood to burn so hot. So they want to get the boiler going. So they throw in these big hams of bacon, which is just, like lots of fat and stuff. And of course, it blows the ship up.
I think people did used to chuck in definitely kind of combustibles of all varieties when you were steamboat racing. And Mayne Reid, actually, I talk about Mayne Reid in my latest book.
So what's your latest book? We didn't mention.
Yes, that's a sequel of sorts to River of Dreams. Because River of Dreams is a kind of cultural history of the river before the Civil War. It kind of ends at the Civil War. And so my latest book, which is called Deep Water, the Mississippi River in the Age of Mark Twain, which is also LSU.
I like the pun.
Yeah. Deep Water, does a lot of work there, But that picks up the story in a sense with at the moment that Twain joins the river. So what I do in that book is I follow through all of Twain's major river writings. So I start with Old Times on the Mississippi, which is a series of articles that he writes for the Atlantic magazine in the 1870s about his experiences piloting. It's a really important publication for him. It kind of signals his transition from someone who's understood to be primarily just a kind of a humorist with a kind of lowly social capital to a writer who might be taken more seriously. So I start with Old Times on the Mississippi, then talk about Tom Sawyer, Life on the Mississippi, Huck Finn, of course, and then Pudd'nhead Wilson.
It's a much darker work than Tom Sawyer. You think of him as a pair of books, but he's gotten older, and some of that, like pessimism and grimness has worked its way into this. Tom Sawyer is a lark. Huck Finn is serious, man.
Yeah, and I think particularly Pudd'nhead Wilson, which is the last book I cover in there, which is Twain's last major book on the river. That's the one where things really get serious. I think that's the one where the pessimism of Twain's viewpoint becomes kind of total, really, in the way that he talks about race and the river. I think Huck Finn, there's still a certain amount of optimism in there that Twain has, to a certain degree. I think yes, it is absolutely a more serious book than Tom Sawyer. Although Tom Sawyer has some interesting undertows in it, to use a river metaphor. I think as well. There is Tom Sawyer is a book which has some hidden depths, I think, and I try and draw some of those out, I think, in this book. But yeah, so the purpose of the book is to think about each of those major river books by Twain. But what I do is I build around them a context for what else is going on in river culture and American culture more broadly, as Twain is writing those books, and the very different kinds of rivers that flow into his vision of the Mississippi. So to try and allow those writers, those artists, those musicians who are also coming from the river and talking about the river at this point, their moment, if you like, outside of Twain's shadow, whilst also reading them in a way that helps us, I think, understand Twain's river vision more deeply as well.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your research, because you're over there in England. Have you made a lot of trips to the New World? And if so, where did you find most of your research? Like, where were your sources for this?
Sure. I mean, I've been to Louisiana a couple of times on research trips. Been to Hannibal, Twain's, well, not birthplace, but certainly his childhood home.
And they're totally identified with Twain. I mean, every year there's a Tom Sawyer and Becky Thatcher picked out from the kids to be. That's their job for the year. After school, they're Tom and Becky every day for a year. So.
Yeah, I mean it's and also they're doing a great job at the boyhood home there. I think of bringing Twain into the 21st century in the way that they present him in his childhood there. I think so. So they're doing a great job there.
There's this fascinating film clip. I guess it's in the Burns documentary, but. Mm-hmm. As an old man, one day he just gets off. I can't remember if it was a train or a boat in Hannibal. He hadn't really announced that he was coming, but he's Sam Clemens. You can't hide the guy, and they immediately recognize him. And it's just an impromptu, Sam Clemens Day. By the lunchtime, all the boys are Tom Sawyer, and all the girls are Becky Thatcher, and he has dinner with the woman that was the model for Becky Thatcher, and it's just it's an amazing picture, and a lot of it was Go ahead.
No, I think that's probably from his last trip back to the river, which I write about in the epilogue to this book as well, actually. And he gets a kind of final victory lap on the river, if you like. He goes to get an honorary doctorate in St. Louis and travels back to Hannibal.
That was it.
Yeah, and gets to pilot a steamboat for the last time. And
wow! And they said he cried because he knew that was it.
That's the last time. Yeah. It's quite a big media moment, that actually. And there's a lot of press coverage of that moment. Yeah, but actually, most of my research really is online. These days, working on the 19th century, so much is digitized, so much kind of contemporary press stuff, and some archival stuff as well.
Thank God for public domain.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean the difference in my research practice when from writing the first book, which was published in 2007, to this book, which is published in 2019, so last year. It's a totally different world, even in that decade, really, in terms of what material is available to you.
The Mark Twain Archive is an awesome resource. We could give a shout out. Isn't it in California, of all places? Am I remembering that right? Yeah.
And they've got lots of letters up, which are really useful. And I think they're still digitizing. But that will be whenever that gets finished, that will be awesome. But most of the stuff that I'm interested in writing about in this book is stuff that was not kind of buried in archives. It was stuff that was published in journals and books across the 19th century. So it's amazing what you can get online these days if you're looking in the right places.
Archive.org has a lot of that stuff.
Yes, that's a great place.
What do they call it?
Hathy Trust. Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Yes, I spend a lot of time on both of those websites.
The first several years I was doing this project, I didn't, look at the URL very closely. I was, boy, Haiti really has a lot of good stuff. And finally, one day the nickel dropped, and I realized, that's not Haiti.
Yeah. No, that's a gold mine, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And the Making of America project. Which is Cornell and Michigan, I think. That was a joint enterprise between those two. That was very useful as well when that came online back in the day. So most of it is I've been able to get from those sources, but also British Libraries down the road from me.
Oh, right.
So that's that has pretty much. Certainly not everything in an American context, but it's still got an amazing.
A lot. I mean, that's one of the places we studied when I was in grad school. The professor was kind of drooling when he talked about.
It does have a lot of stuff, definitely.
Oh, yeah. Right. So, have you been back to do a reading and to publicize your books? I think you would have once this COVID stuff is, and maybe you could do Zoom stuff, like, get with the Cabildo or some one of the local museums, do a reading from, or a talk.
I did the first book, back for River of Dreams, I did a few readings, but not for this one yet. So maybe. In fact, I'm going to start working on this Walter Scott project, which will involve. Definitely a good chapter on Twain and his ambiguous relationship to Walter Scott. You know, I think he liked him really on some level.
Well, there is a way in which you establish your style by critiquing the style before you, and he was famous for that, like Last of the Mohicans. You know, he just totally. Who wrote that? Was it Longfellow? Cooper, James. Yeah. But it just a total send up of this old style, but look at me, I've got this new style. You know.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the realists as a group do that, but you know,
they're very Oedipal in that sense. Kill the father and.
Yeah. But when Twain's writing something like Prince and the Pauper, for example, that kind of historic romance, you know, he rushes straight to Walter Scott to get some inspiration and get some detail. So
there's another Free the Slaves moment. I forgot about that, Prince and the Pauper. Yeah.
Oh right, yes, it's an interesting book, that one, definitely. I write about that a little bit in Deep Water as well, because of the way that it involves the Thames as a symbol. So
right.
Yeah, he's interested in other rivers as well. So I like to talk about those.
A thinly veiled metaphor for the Mississippi.
Right. Yeah.
It's not the Thames that you would be around. It's the Thames as it in Mark Twain's imagination. And once again, very small river compared to the Mississippi.
Yes, many Americans point that out during the.
You have one of those ribbon maps of the Mississippi. I thought about that when you were talking about the diorama. I mean, not physical copy necessarily, but download the JPEG.
Yeah, they're amazing, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And the meander maps as well are very popular online these days.
Oh my God, yeah. Those are.
Yeah, they pop up all the time online because they are fascinating to look at. And
I know, it's like if you don't know what you're looking at, it's just like modern art of some kind. Like, what is this?
Yeah.
But it's kind of chaos in action. So
yeah.
Well, we've been going about an hour. Did we miss anything you would like to bring out that I forgot to ask?
No, I think that probably
good.
That probably covers things, I think, you know. So
I've been enjoying watching your fire in the background. Here in New Orleans, the windows are open, and
there we go. Yes, you can see it flickering. Yeah. Yes, it's getting wintry here. So yeah.
Time to make your way to South Louisiana. I think we're almost done with hurricane season. So
okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
The other project I've got on the go, as well as we're talking about fireplaces in winter now, is next winter I should be releasing an anthology of 19th century Christmas stories.
Oh, cool!
Through Louisiana as well, actually. So that's I should be delivering the final manuscript on that soon.
We would love to have you back to talk about the stories in that. When it
I'd be delighted to. Yeah.
I know it's a little in the 20th century, but Whistling Dick's Christmas Stocking by O. Henry. Have you come across that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He's big in the Christmas story world. Yeah, and obviously, The Gift of the Magi is probably his most famous.
Well, that's the one everybody reads. I like Whistling Dick so much better.
Yes, it is a good one. I'll give you that one. Yeah. It's amazing. It kind of spans the whole 19th century, and I'm attempting to make a case for Christmas's place in the American literary canon. So yeah, I'd love to come back and talk about that when it's ready. It should be this time next year, I think.
Well, you should check out the Doctors Robbins at Louisiana Tech. Karen, wait. Shoot, I don't know why I can't. Oh, Dorothy and Ken, because they've done several Christmas short story books, like collections of anthologies of the type you're talking about. And one of them was Louisiana. So.
Yes, I've got the Southern Christmas one as well that there was out a while ago. I think Judy Long.
Christmas in Ohio. I mean, for a few years they were coming out with, it looked like it was going to be every state, and then they kind of went on to other stuff. But it's they're writing in the area you're talking about. So
yes, yeah.
Well, it's been so nice meeting you, Tom, and
thank you.
Let us know when that next book comes out, because that's something we like to help authors publicize their work so they can sell more books. And it ties in. We're kind of a cultural podcast, and we want to help connect people with the culture of the state. And somebody might not know that you're over there in England doing stuff about Louisiana. So.
Yes, you know, there's more of us than you might imagine. So yeah,
we've come across a few. This is not our first transatlantic.
Sure,
and we talked to somebody in Australia a while back. I can't remember who that was right offhand, but
yeah, we're everywhere.
That's it. Hey, a lot of important research to be done in New Orleans, man.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
I don't always write down my research. I'm kind of like Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens. You know, some of that research you just keep to yourself. Yeah. Well, thank you. I hope you have a good day and a good winter there.
No, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Talking to you too.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.